Once upon a time, there was an eccentric reclusive woman named Evelyn who lived alone in a mansion on the outskirts of town. She was known for her love of spiders and had collected an extensive collection of arachnids from all over the world. However, her obsession with spiders went beyond mere fascination, and rumors circulated that she practiced dark magic using her beloved eight-legged creatures. Evelyn was a tall, slender woman in her early 60s with long, silver hair that she kept tied in a bun. Her piercing blue eyes were intense and seemed to gleam with a strange excitement whenever she talked about spiders. She often wore long, flowing dresses that were embroidered with intricate spider designs. Evelyn had always been a strange child, even from a young age. She would often spend hours alone in the woods, observing insects and other small creatures. As she grew older, her fascination with spiders intensified, and she began to collect them in earnest. Evelyn's parents were concerned about their daughter's strange behavior and sent her to therapy, but nothing seemed to help. By the time she reached adulthood, Evelyn had become a recluse, living alone in her mansion on the outskirts of town. Her obsession with spiders only grew more intense over time. She spent countless hours studying them, learning everything she could about their behavior and biology. She even began to experiment with breeding different spider species to create new hybrids. Eventually, rumors began to circulate about Evelyn's use of dark magic to control her spiders, but no one dared to confront her. It wasn't until the incident with the teenagers that anyone realized just how far her obsession had taken her. Despite the danger she posed, some people felt sorry for Evelyn, believing that her obsession was simply a coping mechanism for some unknown trauma in her past. But as far as anyone knew, she kept her secrets locked away, hidden behind the walls of her spider-filled mansion. One night, a group of teenagers dared each other to sneak into Evelyn's mansion and steal one of her prized spiders as a prank. Despite their fear, they snuck into her mansion and found their way to the spider room, where they encountered an alarming sight. Hundreds of spiders of all shapes and sizes crawled across every surface, covering the walls, ceiling, and floor. In the center of the room, Evelyn stood with her eyes closed, chanting in a language the teenagers didn't understand. The teens quickly realized their mistake and tried to escape, but Evelyn's spiders had other plans. They crawled over the teenagers' bodies, biting and injecting them with venom that paralyzed their muscles. The teens screamed and writhed in agony as Evelyn watched, smiling coldly. The next day, the teenagers were reported missing, and the police searched the mansion for clues. What they found was the stuff of nightmares. The spider room was now empty, but the walls were covered in intricate webs that spelled out a message.
I have found new friends.
It said that anyone who enters Evelyn's mansion never returns, and the town's residents now avoid the eccentric reclusive woman and her spider-filled home. But some say that if you listen closely, you can still hear the screams of the teenagers trapped within the mansion's walls, a haunting reminder of the price they paid for their foolishness.
At Ravenswood Hall, a grand estate, the locals whispered tales of fate, a legend of a phantom's wail that echoed through the empty trail. They say he haunts the darkened halls. With shadowy fingers, he scrawls words of warning on the walls, and to his presence each man appalls. The family who owned the estate had fled in fear of their own fate, leaving behind their cherished home to the phantom who now roams. It's said the ghost is a cursed soul, whose body lies within a hidden hole, beneath the floors of Ravenswood, where he rots alone and misunderstood. The villagers say, on certain nights, the phantom's screams pierce through the heights, as he cries out for release from his eternal, lonely lease. But none dare venture near the hall, for fear of the phantom's angry call. And those who have, they never return to tell the tale of what they learned. The legend grew with each passing year, filling the hearts of all with fear. And Ravenswood Hall remained a cursed abode, forever stained. So if you pass by on a darkened night and hear the phantom's wails ignite, just remember, don't look back, or you'll join the phantom's cursed pack.
Kaya had always been a brave and curious teenager. So when she met Carmen, a quiet and reserved girl in her school, she was eager to get to know her better. The two quickly became close friends, and Carmen eventually invited Kaya over to her house after school. As soon as Kaya entered the house, she was struck by the eerie atmosphere. The air felt heavy and still, and there was a sense of foreboding that seemed to linger in every corner. In one particular room, in a tower high in the house, the walls were lined with shelves, each one packed with hundreds of dolls and miniature dollhouses. They were all exquisitely crafted, with intricate details and lifelike expressions, but there was something unsettling about them that made Kaya's skin crawl. Carmen's mother, Amanda, was a doll maker and took great pride in her craft. She showed Kaya around the doll room, pointing out each doll and describing how she had painstakingly crafted them from scratch. Kaya couldn't help but be impressed by Amanda's skill, but she couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that lingered in the air. As the evening went on, Kaya began to realize that Amanda was not only a doll maker but also a strict and domineering parent. She would scold Carmen and her younger brother Jacob for the slightest misbehavior, often resorting to harsh punishments. Kaya couldn't help but feel sorry for the children who seemed to be trapped in their mother's shadow. One night, while Kaya was staying over at Carmen's house, Amanda became convinced that the children had been misbehaving. Without warning, she turned them both into dolls and placed them on the shelf with the rest of her collection. Kaya watched in horror as the other dolls came to life and began to harass Carmen and Jacob, who were cognizant of the pain and torment they were receiving but powerless to stop it. They were trapped in the hard, motionless bodies of porcelain dolls. Kaya looked on in terror, wondering what would happen if her beloved friends were broken. Afraid to do or say anything, Kaya remained in bed pretending to sleep. And when morning came, Carmen had returned in her regular-sized human being forms. In tears she explained to Kaya that she and her brother tried so very hard to behave, but that their mother was always mad. She would turn them into dolls overnight anytime she wanted to punish them. In fact, sometimes Carmen and Jacob had worried that the other dolls had once been people too. Other souls who had crossed their wicked mother. Kaya was shocked and told Carmen they had to go to the police, or at very least, their school counselor. But Carmen chuckled darkly, lifelessly, and pointed out there was no way such an insane claim could be proven. Kaya knew she had to do something to help her friends. She snuck into Amanda's room and searched for a way to reverse the spell of the dolls. But as she frantically searched through the shelves, Amanda caught her in the act. In a fit of rage, Amanda turned Kaya into a doll and placed her on a dusty shelf up near the ceiling. Days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months. Kaya remained a stiff and lifeless doll, forced to watch as Amanda sat in dusty rays of gloomy sun, continuing to create more dolls and sell them to collectors around the world. Kaya could feel the pain and suffering of each doll she created and could do nothing but watch in horror as their lives were taken away from them. And of course, the dolls grew bitter quickly and lived to fight at night until such time that Amanda would pluck them from their shelf and ship them off to some unknown, unsuspecting place. The community mourned the missing teen, Kaya. Carmen and Jacob were forced to go along with prayer vigils and search parties, even though they knew Kaya was carelessly tossed on their mother's shelf, gathering dust and likely going insane. Years went by, and Kaya remained trapped on the shelf, frozen in time. The dolls around her grew old and worn, but they remained just as they were, unable to escape the horrors of their past. Carmen and Jacob grew up and fortunately could escape, and they eventually left Kaya behind with their mother, the doll maker. The atmosphere in the room grew even more eerie as time went on. The dolls came to life at night, their eyes glowing in the darkness. They would whisper to each other, plotting and scheming, and Kaya could feel their malevolent energy pulsing through the air. The dolls began to take on a life of their own, their expressions growing more sinister with each passing year. Some of them had cracked and missing limbs, and their eyes seemed to follow Kaya's every move. Others had twisted features, with mouths frozen in a grotesque rictus, as if they were trapped in an eternal scream. Kaya felt like she was going mad, trapped in this endless nightmare with no escape. She could feel the weight of Amanda's gaze on her, even though she was long gone, and the dolls around her seemed to be closing in, suffocating her with their twisted energy. At one time, the doll room in Amanda's long-since abandoned house was discovered by a group of collectors. The collectors were amazed by the quality and craftsmanship of Amanda's dolls. They were set to pay a high price for each one, eager to add them to their collections. But when they reached the shelf where Kaya was trapped, they noticed something strange. The dolls on the shelf seemed to be emanating a sinister energy, and the collectors could feel their malevolent gaze piercing through them. As soon as they picked up the Kaya doll, they could feel the pain and torment that she had been experiencing for years. They were shocked and horrified by what they had unwittingly stumbled upon, but not believing their intuition, they quickly returned to Kaya's dirty shelf and ran scared away from the house. Kaya remained there, frozen in time, for decades more until the house was discovered once again by a group of urban explorers. When they found the dolls, they felt an eerie energy emanating from them. But they had no idea that one of the dolls held a trapped consciousness inside, so they left her there among the toxic mold and rat droppings. And so Kaya remained, forever trapped on the shelf, her consciousness doomed to spend eternity as a creepy doll on Amanda's shelf.
The world had fallen to ruin. The dead had risen and overthrown the living, transforming them into the walking dead. Cities were now nothing more than ghost towns, and the once beautiful countryside was now a wasteland of decaying corpses and shattered buildings. It had been 2 years since the outbreak began, and the last survivor was a woman named Letty. She had managed to survive this long by staying on the move, always staying one step ahead of the zombies that roamed the land. Letty had lost everyone she had ever cared about to the outbreak. Her husband, her children, her friends, all of them had either turned into zombies or been killed by them. She had learned to be tough, to fend for herself, and to always be ready for danger. Letty had been on the road for weeks, moving from one abandoned town to another, always searching for supplies and a place to rest. She was exhausted both physically and emotionally, and the weight of her loneliness was crushing. One day, as Letty was making her way through a small town, she saw a figure in the distance. At first, she thought it was a zombie, but as it got closer, she realized it was a man. He was walking slowly, shuffling his feet, and his eyes were unfocused. Letty approached him cautiously, but when she got closer, she saw that he was alive. He was malnourished and weak, but he was still alive. Letty took the man under her wing, and together they continued their journey through the wasteland. They scrounged for food and water, always staying alert for the danger that lurked around every corner. As they traveled, they talked and shared stories of their lives before the outbreak. The man's name was David, and he had been a doctor before the world fell apart. He had been treating patients when the outbreak began, and he had been forced to abandon his hospital and flee for his life. David had been on his own for weeks, and he was overjoyed to have found someone to share his journey with. Letty was equally happy to have found someone who understood the pain and loneliness she had been feeling. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Letty and David became close friends, and they relied on each other for survival. They encountered other survivors along the way, some of whom joined their group, but most of whom were killed by the zombies. One day, as they were walking through a dense forest, they heard a noise. It was a sound they had never heard before, a deep growling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. They stopped in their tracks and looked around, but they couldn't see anything. The growling continued, getting louder and more intense. Letty and David realized that they were surrounded by zombies, and they were in serious trouble. They had been caught off guard, and they had no idea how many zombies were closing in on them. They drew their weapons and prepared to fight, but they knew it was going to be a brutal battle. The growling was so loud now that they couldn't even hear themselves think. The first zombie emerged from the trees, and Letty swung her weapon, decapitating it in one swift motion. David was right behind her, his own weapon swinging in a deadly arc. The battle was fierce and relentless, with zombies pouring out of the trees in a never-ending stream. Letty and David fought with everything they had, their muscles burning and their hearts racing. As the battle raged on, Letty realized that something was wrong. The zombies were acting strangely, almost as if they were more intelligent than normal. Letty couldn't believe what she was seeing. The zombies were coordinated, working together to attack her and David. They were no longer just mindless creatures wandering aimlessly, but they were actually communicating with each other. David shouted to Letty,
"They're not normal zombies! They're different! We need to get out of here!"
But it was too late. The zombies had surrounded them completely, and the two survivors were outnumbered. Letty and David fought valiantly, taking down zombie after zombie, but there were just too many of them. The zombies were relentless, and they kept coming at them from all sides. In a moment of desperation, Letty remembered a rumor she had heard about a cure for the zombie virus. She had heard that there was a research facility in a nearby city that was working on a cure, but she had always dismissed it as just a myth. But now, with no other options left, Letty decided to take the chance. She yelled to David,
"We need to get to that research facility. Maybe they can help us."
David nodded, and together they fought their way out of the zombie horde. They ran as fast as they could, their hearts pounding in their chests, with the zombies hot on their heels. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached the city where the research facility was supposed to be. The city was a maze of abandoned buildings and deserted streets, and they had no idea where to go. But then, they heard a sound that filled them with hope. It was the sound of a helicopter. They raced towards the sound, and they saw a military helicopter hovering above a nearby building. They shouted and waved their arms, hoping to get the attention of the pilots. To their relief, the helicopter landed, and the pilots motioned for them to climb aboard. As they flew away from the city, Letty and David looked down at the zombies below. They knew that they were the lucky ones, that they had escaped the fate that had befallen so many others. But as they looked at each other, they knew that they had a long road ahead of them. They didn't know what would happen next, whether the cure would work or if they would be infected forever. But they knew that they would face whatever came their way together. And so, as they flew towards an uncertain future, Letty and David held onto each other tightly, grateful to be alive and filled with hope for what lay ahead.
The sky turned red as a fleet of alien ships descended upon Earth. It was the year 2047, and humanity had been taken by surprise. The aliens were not like anything we had ever seen before. They were tall, with 4 arms and eyes that glowed like fire. They spoke in a language that no one could understand, and they seemed to be here for one reason: to take over. Within weeks, the aliens had established their dominance over the planet. They set up their own government, with their own rules and laws. Humans were relegated to second-class citizens, forced to do the aliens' bidding. It was a world of fear and oppression, where the aliens ruled with an iron fist. The few humans who dared to resist were quickly silenced. They were either killed or sent to labor camps, where they were forced to work in factories or on construction sites. There was no hope of escape, no hope of freedom. It was a world of darkness and despair. But there were some who refused to give up. A small group of humans banded together to form a resistance movement. They hid in the shadows, striking at the aliens whenever they could. They were a ragtag group, armed with whatever weapons they could scavenge, but they were determined to fight back. One of the leaders of the resistance was a woman named Destiny. She had lost everything when the aliens arrived: her family, her home, her way of life. But she refused to give up. She was a fighter, a survivor. One night, Destiny and a small group of rebels were on a mission to sabotage an alien factory. They crept through the streets, trying to avoid detection. But they were spotted by an alien patrol.
"Stop right there.
The lead alien shouted.
You are in violation of the law. Surrender immediately."
The rebels hesitated for a moment, then Destiny raised her weapon and fired. The aliens returned fire, and a fierce battle broke out in the streets. It was chaos, bullets flying, explosions ringing out. The rebels fought with everything they had, but they were vastly outnumbered. Destiny ducked behind a crumbling building, trying to catch her breath. She was bleeding from a wound in her shoulder, but she refused to give up. She had come too far to let the aliens win. The resistance grew stronger with each passing day. They launched more attacks on the aliens, sabotaging their factories, disrupting their supply lines. It was a guerrilla war, fought in the shadows, but the humans were gaining ground. And then, one day, the aliens made a fatal mistake. They decided to launch a final assault on the resistance. They brought in their biggest ships, their most advanced weapons. They were determined to crush the humans once and for all. The resistance was ready. They had been preparing for this moment for months. They had dug trenches, built fortifications, and gathered every weapon they could find. It was going to be a bloody battle, but they were ready to fight. The aliens descended upon the resistance stronghold, unleashing a barrage of weapons fire. The humans fought back with everything they had. It was a brutal, savage battle, with no quarter given on either side. Destiny was at the forefront of the battle, leading the charge. She was wounded again and again, but she refused to give up. She fought with all her might, determined to see the aliens defeated. And in the end, they were. The resistance emerged victorious, but at a heavy cost. Most of the rebels had been killed.
Lydia Dietz pulled up to the Maitland house, the home of her deceased friends Adam and Barbara Maitland, who she had not seen in years. The last time she was here was a rainy day after the funeral of her dear parents, Delia and Charles. She remembered it vividly. A few years into Lydia's college education, her parents had moved back to a fancy apartment in the city. However, since they'd long since grown to love the Maitlands and think of them as family, they kept ownership of the White House on the hills so that the Maitlands could live in peace. Lydia used to visit frequently. But then, tragically, her parents were taken from her when their limo crashed on a rainy night in the city. That is, they were taken from her briefly. And then, the afterlife sent them back to their ritzy apartment. Lydia felt terribly lucky to get to live on with her parents, even after they died. She inherited all their property, but soon her visits to the Maitland house dwindled down, and now she was visiting for the first time in years. She shook her head, trying to shake off the memories, and approached the front door. As she knocked on the door, she heard a faint voice from inside.
Hold on, I'm coming.
The voice was familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. The door creaked open, and she was greeted by none other than the ghost with the most, Beetlejuice.
Lydia! Babe! It's been too long!
Beetlejuice exclaimed. He lunged forward to kiss her, but she effortlessly dodged. Beetlejuice's unpleasant smell radiated off him and wafted into her face, almost gagging her. Lydia stepped back, slightly taken aback by his exuberance.
Beetlejuice, what are you doing here? Where are Adam and Barbara?
Beetlejuice's face fell slightly.
Oh, they're here, Lydia. They're always here.
Lydia furrowed her brow in confusion.
What do you mean?
They're stuck here, Lydia. Trapped, you might say.
Beetlejuice said, a sly grin spreading across his face. Lydia's heart sank. She knew that the Maitlands were unable to leave the house, but she had hoped that they had found a way to move on.
Is there anything we can do to help them?
Beetlejuice chuckled.
Well, there's always a way, Lydia. But first, why don't you come inside and catch up? It's been far too long.
Lydia hesitated for a moment before nodding and following Beetlejuice into the house. As they walked through the halls, Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She turned around, but no one was there. Beetlejuice noticed her unease and grinned.
Don't worry, Lydia. It's just the usual hauntings. We'll get used to it in no time.
Lydia forced a smile, but her mind was racing. She had always been fascinated by the supernatural, but she had never experienced anything like this before. She had a feeling that this was going to be a long, strange visit. Lydia settled into the living room with Beetlejuice, who had poured her a glass of ectoplasmic champagne and lit a fire in the fireplace. They chatted for a while about what Lydia had been up to since they last saw each other, but it was clear that Beetlejuice had an ulterior motive for inviting her over.
So, Lydia, I couldn't help but notice that you're looking for a new project to sink your teeth into.
Beetlejuice said, swirling his drink. Lydia raised an eyebrow.
What do you mean?
Well, I just so happen to know of a little business opportunity that might interest you.
Beetlejuice said, his grin widening. Lydia was intrigued.
What kind of opportunity?
Beetlejuice leaned in, lowering his voice.
Have you ever heard of the underworld?
Lydia's eyes widened.
You mean like hell?
Beetlejuice nodded.
That's the one. See, there's a market down there for all kinds of things. Souls, of course, but also trinkets, oddities, you name it. And I happen to have a little business venture in mind.
Lydia wasn't sure if she liked where this was going.
I don't know, Beetlejuice. I'm not exactly in the business of dealing with the afterlife.
Beetlejuice waved his hand dismissively.
Oh, come on, Lydia. You're a writer. You have a fascination with the macabre. This is right up your alley. And think of the profits!
Lydia hesitated. She had always been fascinated by the idea of the afterlife, but she wasn't sure she wanted to get involved in something so shady. As if sensing her hesitation, Beetlejuice leaned in again.
Just think about it, Lydia. The underworld is full of untapped potential. And with your talent, we could really make something of it.
Lydia considered Beetlejuice's proposal for a moment before nodding slowly.
All right, I'll think about it.
Beetlejuice grinned triumphantly.
That's what I like to hear. Now let's go find the Maitlands. I'm sure they're dying to see you.
Lydia followed Beetlejuice through the house, still feeling a little uneasy about his business proposal. As they entered the Maitland study, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. The room was just as she remembered it, with all of Adam and Barbara's personal belongings still in place. She wondered how they were coping with being stuck in the house for so long. Adam and Barbara appeared, floating down from the ceiling. They looked happy to see Lydia, but there was a hint of something in their eyes that Lydia couldn't quite place. It almost looked like fear.
Lydia! It's so good to see you!
Adam said, smiling warmly. Barbara echoed his sentiment.
Yes, we've missed you.
Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that something was off.
Are you two okay?
Adam and Barbara exchanged a quick glance before Adam spoke up.
We're fine, Lydia. Just a little bored, I suppose.
Lydia wasn't convinced, but she didn't press the matter. Instead, she decided to change the subject.
So how have you two been keeping busy?
Barbara looked sheepish.
Well, we've been redecorating, mostly. Trying to make the best of our situation.
Adam nodded.
Yes. And we've been practicing our ghostly powers. It's not much, but it's something.
Lydia spent the rest of the day catching up with Adam and Barbara, who seemed to be hiding something from her. They were overly cheerful and kept changing the subject whenever she asked about their confinement in the house. Lydia couldn't help but feel like there was more going on than they were letting on. As evening approached, Lydia decided to head to the hotel in town. She was of course welcome to stay in the Maitland house, but something felt sad about staying there without her parents. Beetlejuice offered to escort her out, but she declined.
I think I can manage on my own,
she said, smiling. Beetlejuice shrugged.
Suit yourself. Just remember to keep me in mind about that business venture.
Lydia nodded.
I'll think about it.
As she made her way down the path to the front gate, she heard a strange noise behind her. It sounded like someone or something was following her. She turned around, but saw nothing. Brushing it off as her imagination, she continued walking. Suddenly, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She turned around again, but still saw nothing. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she realized she was alone in the darkness.
Who's there?
She called out, her voice trembling. No answer. She heard the noise again, louder this time. It was definitely getting closer. She turned to run, but something grabbed her ankle, causing her to fall to the ground. Panic set in as she struggled to get up, but the unseen force was too strong. She could feel it pulling her towards the house. She screamed for help, but there was no one around to hear her. Just as she was about to be dragged back into the house, she felt another hand grab her, pulling her in the opposite direction. She looked up to see Adam and Barbara, who had apparently been following her.
What was that?
Lydia gasped, still shaken. Adam and Barbara exchanged a worried look before Adam spoke up.
We don't know. Something's been happening in the house lately. We've been hearing strange noises and feeling a presence. We thought it was just our imaginations, but, well, we were wrong.
Lydia shuddered.
I don't think I want to know what's going on in there.
Barbara put a hand on Lydia's shoulder.
Just be careful, Lydia. Something isn't right.
Lydia nodded, feeling grateful for their help.
I will. Thanks, you guys.
As she made her way back to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Something was definitely off in the Maitland house, and she wasn't sure she wanted to get involved in whatever it was. But at the same time, she couldn't deny her curiosity. She had to know what was going on. Lydia couldn't stop thinking about what had happened at the Maitland house. She had always been drawn to the strange and unusual, but this was different. There was something dark and ominous lurking in that house, and she needed to know what it was. After all, who had ever heard of haunted ghosts? Weren't ghosts normally the haunters, not the haunted? The next day, she decided to pay another visit to the Maitlands. She didn't tell them about the strange experience she had the night before, but instead tried to act casual as she asked them if they needed any help around the house. Adam and Barbara were hesitant at first, but eventually agreed to let her help with some cleaning and organizing. As they worked, Lydia couldn't help but notice how uneasy they seemed. They kept looking over their shoulders and jumping at every little noise.
Are you guys okay?
She finally asked, breaking the awkward silence. Barbara sighed.
No, Lydia. Something's been happening in this house. We can't explain it, but we know something's not right.
Lydia felt a chill run down her spine.
What kind of things?
Adam hesitated.
We've been hearing strange noises at night. Voices, footsteps, things moving around. And we've been seeing things. Shadows, figures. We thought we were going crazy at first, but now we know we're not alone in this house.
Lydia didn't know what to say. She had always believed in the supernatural, particularly since her parents had brought her to this house. But she never expected to encounter something like this. Ghosts haunting other ghosts seemed simply absurd.
What do you think it is?
She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Adam and Barbara exchanged a look before Barbara spoke up.
We think it's something from the underworld. We've heard stories about how this house is a portal to the afterlife. I mean, we know that we can access the netherworld from here. But as for the underworld, we never believed it. Until now.
Lydia's eyes widened.
The underworld? Like hell?
Adam nodded.
We don't know for sure, but it's definitely not something we want to mess with.
Lydia nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and excitement. She had always been fascinated by the idea of the afterlife, but even though Adam and Barbara had described the netherworld to her in the past, she never expected to come face to face with any variety of the afterlife while she was still alive.
What can I do to help?
She asked. Barbara hesitated.
Honestly, Lydia, we don't know. We're just trying to keep our heads down and wait it out. We don't want to make things worse.
Lydia nodded, feeling disappointed. She had hoped she could help in some way, but it seemed like there was nothing she could do. As she prepared to leave, she heard a voice behind her.
Hey Lydia. I've been thinking about that business venture we talked about.
Lydia turned to see Beetlejuice standing in the doorway, a sly grin on his face.
What about it?
She asked warily. Beetlejuice's grin widened.
I think I have an idea. But we'll have to talk about it somewhere more private.
Lydia raised an eyebrow.
What kind of idea?
Beetlejuice chuckled.
Let's just say it involves the underworld. And a lot of money.
Lydia felt a mixture of excitement and fear. She had always been drawn to danger, but this was different. This was something beyond her control. But at the same time, she couldn't resist the temptation.
Okay,
She said, her heart racing.
let's talk.
Beetlejuice led Lydia to a secluded corner of the Maitland's attic, away from prying eyes and ears. As they sat down, a plume of dust rose up around them and Lydia coughed. She couldn't help but feel a little nervous. She knew that Beetlejuice was a wild card, and she didn't know what kind of trouble he was about to get her into.
So, what's this idea?
She asked, trying to sound casual. Beetlejuice leaned in closer.
Have you ever heard of the underworld black market?
Lydia shook her head.
No. What is it?
Beetlejuice grinned.
It's a market that operates in the underworld, buying and selling all sorts of illegal goods and services. Drugs, weapons, information, you name it.
Lydia's eyes widened.
And you want us to, what, get involved in it?
Beetlejuice nodded.
Exactly. We can use the portal in this house to travel to the underworld, make some contacts, and start making some serious money.
Lydia hesitated. This was way beyond anything she had ever done before. But at the same time, it was exhilarating. The idea of exploring the underworld, meeting strange and dangerous beings, and making a fortune was too tempting to resist.
And what do we have to do?
She asked. Beetlejuice leaned back and grinned.
Well, we need to get our hands on some valuable goods first. And I happen to know just the thing.
Lydia raised an eyebrow.
What?
Beetlejuice leaned in closer again.
The Book of the Dead.
Lydia's eyes widened.
The Book of the Dead? That's a myth, isn't it?
Beetlejuice shook his head.
No, it's real! And it's worth a fortune in the underworld black market. With that book, we can make enough money to live like royalty for the rest of our lives.
Lydia was skeptical.
And where do we find it?
Beetlejuice grinned.
I happen to know a guy who knows a guy. He's an underworld dealer, and he owes me a favor. I can set up a meeting and we can make the deal.
Lydia thought about it for a moment. It was risky, but it was also a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. She could finally make something of herself, prove to the world that she was more than just a strange and unusual girl.
Okay.
She said finally.
Let's do it.
Beetlejuice grinned.
That's what I like to hear. Now we need to prepare. We'll need some weapons, some disguises, and some backup. And most importantly, we need to keep this a secret from the Maitlands.
Lydia nodded. This was going to be a wild ride. And she couldn't wait to see where it would take her. Over the next few days, Lydia and Beetlejuice prepared for their trip to the underworld. They spent hours poring over maps and gathering supplies, careful to keep their plans a secret from the Maitlands. It was dangerous, but Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that this was her chance to do something important, something that would change her life forever. Finally, the day of the meeting arrived. Lydia and Beetlejuice had donned their disguises and made their way to the portal in the Maitland's attic, where a small group of underworld dealers was waiting for them. The dealers were a motley crew, dressed in leather and chains, with strange tattoos and piercings covering their bodies. Lydia couldn't help but feel a little intimidated as they approached, but Beetlejuice seemed right at home among them.
Hey boys!
He called out, flashing them a grin.
Miss me?
One of the dealers, a tall, imposing figure with horns protruding from his forehead, stepped forward.
Beetlejuice, I see you've brought a friend.
Lydia stepped forward, trying to keep her voice steady.
I'm Lydia.
And you are?
The dealer grinned, revealing rows of sharp teeth.
You can call me Diablo.
Beetlejuice stepped in.
We're here for the Book of the Dead. You got it?
Diablo nodded.
Yeah, I got it. But it's not gonna come cheap. You two better have something good to offer.
Lydia and Beetlejuice exchanged a nervous glance. They had brought all the valuables they could find, but they had no idea if it would be enough. Beetlejuice stepped forward.
Listen, Diablo. We're not here to waste your time. We know what we're doing. We're serious about this.
Diablo studied them for a moment, then nodded.
All right. I'll make you a deal. I'll give you the Book of the Dead, and you give me what you got. But if it's not enough, I'll take your souls instead.
Lydia's heart raced. She had heard stories about the underworld dealers, about how they were ruthless and unforgiving. But she had come too far to back down now.
Deal,
she said. Diablo handed her the book, a thick, leather-bound tome with strange symbols etched into its cover. Lydia's hands shook as she took it, realizing the weight of what she had just done.
Good luck,
Diablo said with a smirk, as he and the other dealers disappeared into the shadows. Lydia and Beetlejuice made their way back to the Maitland's house, the book safely tucked away in Lydia's bag. As they emerged from the portal, Lydia couldn't help but feel a sense of exhilaration. They had done it. They had made their first big score. But as they made their way upstairs, they were met with a surprise. The Maitlands were waiting for them, their faces grim.
What's going on here?
Adam demanded.
What have you two been up to?
Lydia and Beetlejuice exchanged a nervous glance. They had been so caught up in their excitement that they had forgotten to cover their tracks.
We can explain.
Lydia said, her voice trembling. But it was too late. The Maitlands had seen the book, and they knew exactly what it was.
That book is dangerous.
Barbara said, her voice low.
You have no idea what you're messing with.
Lydia tried to protest, to explain that they had done it for the greater good, but the words caught in her throat. She had no choice but to come clean.
We needed it.
She said, holding up the book.
We needed to go to the underworld.
The Maitlands exchanged a worried glance.
Lydia, that's not something to be taken lightly.
Adam said.
The underworld is dangerous, and you could get hurt.
I know.
Lydia said.
But I have to do this. It could help you. And it could help my parents.
The Maitlands looked at her sympathetically. They knew how much Lydia had been struggling with the loss of her parents, even though they were still, sort of, a part of her life.
We'll help you,
Barbara said.
but we have to do it together. We can't let you go alone.
Lydia nodded, grateful for their support. They spent the next few hours poring over the book, trying to decipher its ancient text and figure out a plan. It was slow going, but they were making progress. As they worked, they heard a knock at the door. Lydia tensed, wondering who could be there at this hour. Barbara went to answer it, and Lydia heard a familiar voice from the other room.
Otho?
She said, surprised. Otho emerged from the hallway, looking flustered.
Lydia, thank goodness you're here. I need your help.
Lydia looked at him suspiciously.
What kind of help?
It's the Dietzes!
Otho said, his voice low.
They're in trouble!
Lydia's heart raced. Her parents? What could have possibly gone wrong in the short time she'd been away from home?
What happened?
She said.
They went to the underworld!
Otho said, his voice shaking.
And they never came back!
Lydia's eyes widened.
What? How did they get there?
I don't know.
Otho said.
But I know they were looking for something. Something powerful.
Lydia's mind raced. Could it be the same thing she was looking for? She supposed it made sense they'd be interested in the same slightly wicked deed that she was. After all, they raised her.
We have to go after them,
she said, determination in her voice. The Maitlands looked at her, then at each other.
Are you sure?
Adam said.
It's dangerous.
I'm sure.
Lydia said.
We have to do this. For them. For me. For all of us.
And with that, they set off on their next adventure, ready to face whatever the underworld had in store for them. They made their way to the attic, where the book lay open on the table, waiting for them. Lydia picked it up and flipped through the pages, trying to find the section on the underworld.
Here it is,
she said, pointing to a page covered in intricate symbols and diagrams.
It says we need a special kind of potion to lure wayward spirits back from the underworld.
A potion?
Barbara said, her eyebrows raised. Lydia nodded.
It's made from a rare plant that only grows in the underworld. The scent intoxicates those who are lost, and when they smell it, they will follow you and do your bidding. We have to find it before we can go any further.
But how are we supposed to find it?
Adam said, his voice tinged with frustration. Lydia thought for a moment.
There's someone who might be able to help us,
she said.
Beetlejuice.
The Maitlands exchanged a look, unsure if they could trust the mischievous ghost.
Are you sure that's a good idea?
Barbara said. Lydia shrugged.
It's our best shot. We don't have much time.
They made their way back downstairs, where Beetlejuice was waiting impatiently.
What took you so long?
He said, tapping his foot.
We need your help.
Lydia said, holding up the book.
We need to find a rare plant that grows in the underworld.
Beetlejuice's eyes widened.
You want to go to the underworld?
He said, a sly grin spreading across his face.
We have no choice,
Lydia said.
Will you help us or not?
Beetlejuice looked at her for a moment, considering. Finally, he nodded.
All right,
he said.
I know where to find the plant. But you're gonna owe me big time for this.
They followed Beetlejuice down to the basement, where he led them through a hidden door and into a dimly lit tunnel. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, and Lydia couldn't help but shudder. After what felt like hours of wandering through the labyrinthine tunnels, they finally emerged into a vast cavern. In the center of the cavern, surrounded by twisted vines and gnarled trees, was a glowing plant with leaves that shimmered like diamonds.
That's it.
Beetlejuice said, pointing to the plant.
The plant of the underworld. It's called a death bloom.
Lydia stepped forward, her heart pounding with excitement and fear. She reached out to pluck a leaf from the plant, but as soon as her fingers touched it, the ground beneath them began to shake. A deep rumbling filled the air, and a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness.
You dare to trespass in my realm?
It boomed. Lydia could barely make out its features through the darkness, but she could feel its eyes on her, cold and menacing. Beetlejuice stepped forward, a smirk on his face.
Relax, big guy,
he said.
We're just passing through.
The figure loomed closer, and Lydia could now see that it was a towering, horned creature with eyes that burned like fire.
You will leave now,
it said, its voice like thunder. Lydia could feel her heart racing as she backed away from the creature, but she knew they couldn't leave without the plant.
Please,
she said, her voice shaking.
We need the plant to save my parents. We mean no harm.
The creature seemed to consider her words for a moment, then nodded.
Very well,
it said.
But be warned. The underworld is not a place for the living. If you value your lives, you will not return.
And with that, it disappeared back into the darkness, leaving Lydia and the others standing in stunned silence. Lydia carefully plucked a leaf from the plant and held it up to the dim light. It glimmered in her hand like a tiny star, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe.
Let's go,
she said, turning to face the others.
We have what we came for.
They retraced their steps through the winding tunnels, with Beetlejuice leading the way. Lydia's mind was racing with thoughts of what they might encounter in the underworld, but she knew they had to keep going. Her dad and Delia were counting on them. When they emerged from the tunnel, they found that the sun had already set, and the sky was a deep shade of purple. Lydia shivered as a gust of wind blew through the trees, making the branches creak and groan.
Let's hurry,
Adam said, his voice tense. They made their way back to the Maitland house, with Beetlejuice trailing behind them. As they walked, Lydia could feel his eyes on her, watching her every move.
What do you want from us?
She finally asked, turning to face him. Beetlejuice shrugged.
Just looking out for myself, kid,
he said.
You know how it is.
Lydia nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was up to something. When they reached the house, Lydia set to work on making the potion. She followed the instructions in the book, grinding the leaf into a fine powder and mixing it with other ingredients. As the potion simmered on the stove, the Maitlands paced anxiously around the kitchen. They were so close to saving their old friends, the Dietzes, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something would go wrong. Finally, the potion was ready. Lydia poured it into a small vial and handed it to Adam.
Good luck,
she said, her voice soft. Adam nodded, and he and Barbara drank the potion. For a moment, nothing happened, and Lydia feared the worst. But then, the room began to spin, and a bright light filled the air. The Maitlands vanished from sight, leaving Lydia alone in the kitchen while they bravely ventured back to the underworld to lure her parents out. She collapsed into a chair, feeling dizzy and disoriented. She had done everything she could to save her friends, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it might not be enough. Just then, she heard a sound from upstairs. It was a faint tapping, like someone was knocking on a door. Lydia cautiously made her way up the stairs, her heart pounding. When she reached the top, she found that the attic door was ajar. She pushed it open, and there were Charles and Delia, standing in the center of the room.
Lydia!
Delia cried, rushing forward to embrace her.
You did it! You saved us!
Her father also rushed forward to give her a loving embrace. But as quickly as they appeared, they began to flicker and fade. Delia waved happily.
No worries, we just have to get back to the apartment. You know we can't stay here.
Bye, baby.
Charles said cheerily.
See you at home.
Lydia couldn't help but smile, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. They had made it back safely. And Adam and Barbara were right behind them, coming from the portal which swirled like a whirlpool and then slammed shut, hopefully forever. But then, she heard a sound behind her, and she turned to see Beetlejuice standing in the shadows.
Well,
he said, his eyes gleaming.
Looks like you kids managed to pull it off.
Lydia's heart sank. She knew there was no escaping Beetlejuice's grasp.
What do you want?
She said, her voice trembling. Beetlejuice grinned.
I want what's mine,
he said.
And you, my dear, are going to help me get it.
And with that, he lunged forward, grabbing Lydia by the arm and dragging her into the darkness. The Maitlands heard her screams, but they were too late to save her. Beetlejuice had gotten what he wanted, and he had disappeared into the shadows once again. The Maitlands were left alone in the house once again, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they had failed to protect Lydia from Beetlejuice. They paced anxiously around the empty rooms, unsure of what to do next. As the hours passed, they began to hear strange noises coming from outside. It sounded like a group of people chanting in unison, their voices echoing through the trees. Adam peered out the window and saw a procession of ghosts making their way towards the house. They were dressed in tattered robes and carried torches, and their faces were twisted in grimaces of anger.
Looks like we've got trouble,
he said, his voice tense. Barbara nodded, her eyes wide with fear.
What are we going to do?
Adam thought for a moment before speaking.
We'll have to summon the handbook for the recently deceased,
he said.
It's our only hope.
Together, they made their way to the attic, where the handbook was kept. They had never used it before, but they knew that it contained valuable information on how to deal with the supernatural. As they paged through the handbook, they came across a section on dealing with angry spirits. It advised them to perform a ritual involving salt, sage, and a circle of protection. The Maitlands quickly gathered the materials they needed and began the ritual. They drew a circle of salt around themselves and lit the sage, letting the smoke fill the air. As the ghosts approached, the Maitlands could feel their anger intensifying. But they held firm, focusing on the circle of protection and the power of the handbook. Finally, the ghosts reached the circle, their faces twisted in fury. But as they tried to cross the barrier, they were repelled by an unseen force. The Maitlands watched in amazement as the ghosts howled in frustration and began to fade away. They had done it, they had protected themselves from the angry spirits. As the last ghost disappeared, the Maitlands collapsed onto the floor, exhausted but relieved. They had survived another encounter with the supernatural, thanks to the handbook and their quick thinking. But as they sat there in the darkness, they couldn't help but think of Lydia, and the terrible fate that had befallen her. They vowed to never give up their fight against the forces of evil, no matter how overwhelming the odds might seem. And with that, they settled in for another long night in the world of the dead.
Once upon a time, in a small village, there lived a poor woodcutter and his 2 children, a boy named Hansel and a girl named Gretel. Times were tough and the family struggled to make ends meet, often going hungry for days on end. Stress made the children's stepmother prone to fits of rage. The stepmother was not always cruel to her stepchildren. In fact, she had tried her best to care for them and treat them as her own. But as the village's economic situation worsened, she became increasingly desperate and consumed by her own fears. She saw her own children becoming thinner and weaker each day and worried that they too would soon fall victim to hunger. The thought of losing her own flesh and blood was too much to bear, and in her desperation, she decided to sacrifice her stepchildren in the hopes of saving her own. The stepmother's guilt and shame over her actions consumed her, and she could not bear to face her husband or the other villagers. She isolated herself in their small hut and refused to leave, consumed by her own misery and regret. One day, the woodcutter's wife had had enough of their poverty and decided to take matters into her own hands. She convinced her husband to take the children deep into the forest and leave them there to fend for themselves. The woodcutter was hesitant at first, but his wife's constant nagging and the fear of starving to death finally got the better of him. So, on a dark and stormy night, the woodcutter led Hansel and Gretel deep into the forest and abandoned them. The children cried and begged their father to take them back home, but he refused and left them alone in the wilderness. Hansel and Gretel were scared and alone, but they didn't give up hope. They searched for food and shelter, surviving on berries and mushrooms and drinking water from streams. Eventually, they came across a clearing with a strange-looking house made entirely of gingerbread and candy. In the town, there had been whispers and rumors of witch in the woods. According to the villagers, the witch had lived in the forest for as long as anyone could remember. She was said to be a former resident of the village who had been banished from the community for practicing dark magic and consorting with evil spirits. Legend had it that the witch's obsession with cannibalism had started many years ago when she was still a young woman. Her family had fallen on hard times, and she had resorted to stealing food from her neighbors to survive. One day, she was caught in the act by a group of angry villagers who beat her and left her for dead. In her rage and desperation, the young woman had made a deal with a powerful demon in exchange for revenge against those who had wronged her. The demon granted her wish but cursed her with an insatiable hunger for human flesh, which could only be satisfied by eating the young and innocent. The witch had built her gingerbread house in the forest as a lure for unsuspecting children, and over the years, she had captured and devoured dozens of them. She was said to be immortal, able to regenerate any wounds and heal any sickness by consuming the flesh of the young. The villagers lived in fear of the witch and warned their children never to stray too far into the forest. They believed that the witch's curse had spread to the very trees and animals of the forest, and that anyone who dared to enter her domain would be cursed as well. Despite their fears, the villagers also believed that the witch could be defeated with the help of a hero brave enough to face her. They told tales of a legendary hero who would one day rise up to vanquish the witch and free the children she had captured. But as the years passed, the tales of the hero grew fainter, and the witch's grip on the forest and the hearts of the villagers grew stronger. And so, the legend of the witch lived on, a warning to all who would dare to tempt fate and venture into the darkness of the forest. Hansel and Gretel had heard the tales just as all the children of the village had for generations. And just like the rest of the children, the brother and sister had never believed the legends. Yet, there they stood, in front of the odd cottage which looked like it had fallen out of the pages of a fairy tale. Hansel and Gretel were too hungry and exhausted to even consider the rumors of the townsfolk. The children rushed towards the house, but as they approached, the front door creaked open by itself. They cautiously stepped inside, and to their surprise, they found the interior of the house was even more magnificent than the exterior. The walls were made of sugar glass, the floors were made of gingerbread, and the furniture was made of candy. But the children soon realized that something wasn't right. The air was thick with the scent of rotting flesh, and they could hear strange noises coming from the back of the house. As they made their way towards the source of the sound, they discovered a room filled with human bones and skulls. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, and an old hag appeared from the shadows.
"Welcome, my dear children,"
she said with a sinister smile.
"I've been expecting you."
Hansel and Gretel were frozen with fear as the old hag approached them. She revealed herself to be a witch who had been luring children into her house for years, using the sweet smell of her gingerbread to attract them. She would then capture them, cook them in her oven, and feast on their flesh. The witch locked Hansel in a cage and forced Gretel to work as her servant, making her prepare meals for her and tend to her needs. Every day, the witch would come and check on Hansel, feeling his skin to see if he was plump enough to cook. But Hansel was smart and managed to trick the witch by using a chicken bone to make her think he was still skinny. Meanwhile, Gretel was slowly but surely hatching a plan to save her brother and escape the witch's clutches. One day, while the witch was sleeping, Gretel sneaked into her room and stole the key to Hansel's cage. She set him free, and together they overpowered the witch and locked her in the oven. As they ran out of the house, they heard the witch's screams as she burned to death. They ran through the forest until they reached their village, where their father was waiting for them with open arms. He had regretted abandoning them and had spent every day since searching for them. The family was reunited, but the memories of their ordeal would haunt them forever. The stepmother's actions had disastrous consequences, not only for her stepchildren but also for herself. The guilt and shame of what she had done haunted her until the end of her days, and her name became a curse in the village, spoken only in hushed whispers. After being reunited with his children, the father was consumed by rage and grief. He confronted her in their hut, and in a moment of madness, he strangled her to death. The father was beside himself with guilt and despair, but he knew he had to protect Hansel and Gretel from ever being harmed again, and the other dangers of the forest. Not to mention, if his crimes were discovered in the village, he would surely lose them once again. He packed some supplies and took his children on the run, leaving the village and the horrors they had faced behind. For days they traveled through the forest, with the father constantly looking over his shoulder and Hansel and Gretel clinging to him for safety. They faced hunger, cold, and exhaustion, but the father was determined to keep his children alive. Finally, after many days of wandering, they stumbled upon a small cottage deep in the woods. The owner of the cottage, an old woman, took pity on them and allowed them to stay, providing them with food and shelter. Over time, the father and his children began to heal from the traumas they had faced. Hansel and Gretel were able to put the horrors of the witch and their stepmother behind them, and the father found solace in the love and companionship of his children. Years passed, and the family lived in peace and harmony in their forest home. They were never able to return to their old life in the village, but they had found a new sense of purpose and belonging in the solitude of the woods. And so, the tale of Hansel and Gretel had a bittersweet ending, filled with tragedy and loss, but also with hope and the resilience of the human spirit.
In a world that's lost its way, where the sun hides from the day, the air is thick with stench and grime, and the sky's a sickly shade of slime. The people scuttle to and fro, with faces blank and movements slow. They're all afraid of what may lurk, and the dangers that may go berserk. The neon lights flicker in the night, casting eerie shadows and blight. The sounds that echo through the gloom are enough to make your heart go boom. The rulers reign with iron fists, and the citizens are trapped in mists. They've been oppressed and brought to ground, and nowhere else to be found. The buildings tower, stark and grim, a monument to a world that's dim. The streets are filled with debris and dirt, a world of pain, a world of hurt. But something lingers in the dark, a presence that's left its mark, something old and cruel and vile, hungry for flesh and lacking guile. The people feel it in their souls, the chill that seeps in and takes its toll. They lock their doors and bar their gates, praying for a light that illuminates. But the horrors that they face are true, and they can't escape the night's dark hue. For the world they're living in is lost, a world where only the monstrous accost. So take heed, all you who dare to tread this land of nightmares, for the horrors that you'll face are real in this world that's lost its way and seal. In this world of darkness and woe, where the past is all but a shadow, the future's bleak, a murky sight, a world devoid of hope and light. The creatures that roam the streets are twisted and vile, with razor-sharp teeth, their eyes gleaming with hunger and thirst for the flesh of the living, the flesh of the cursed. The rulers are blind to the plight of the people who cower in the night. They care not for their pain and strife, for they hold the power of life. The air is thick with the stench of decay, and the ground is slick with blood and decay. The screams of the dying, the moans of the dead, echo through the night, filling all with dread. But amidst the chaos and despair, a glimmer of hope, a spark of a prayer, a resistance that's rising, a rebellion so true, a flicker of light, a hope so new. And with the power of unity and might, they'll fight to make things right, to bring back the world that's been lost. A world with beauty, a world without cost. So beware, all you who tread this land, for the horrors that you'll face are grand. But with courage, and hope, and a will to fight, you may yet emerge into the world of light.
Ever since she was a little girl, Marley had been afraid of letting her feet dangle over the side of the bed. It was a fear that had been instilled in her by her mother, a woman who wasn't quite right. She's filled Marley's furthest back memories with stories of monsters and creatures lurking in the darkness, waiting to snatch up unsuspecting children who didn't keep their feet safely tucked under the covers. As she grew older, Marley tried to shake the fear and discard her mother's dark imaginings. She told herself it was childish, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But every time she let her feet slip over the edge of the bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She couldn't help but jerk them back under the covers to perceived safety. But one night, she heard a strange noise coming from under the bed. It was a low growling sound, like an animal breathing heavily. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest, as the noise grew louder and more menacing. Marley told herself that she was asleep and dreaming. She decided to reality check herself. She grappled for her phone to check the time. Unfortunately, it clearly reported the accurate time. Which, in case you aren't aware, in dreams, clocks are blurry or say the wrong time. Suddenly, it stopped. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just her imagination. But as the nights wore on, the fear only grew stronger. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was reaching out from under the bed, waiting to grab her ankles and drag her down into the darkness. And then, one night, it happened. She was asleep in bed when her foot slipped out from under the cover and over the side. The motion snapped her awake, and she felt something brush against her foot. It was a cold, slimy touch, like the fingers of a corpse. And they tickled her toes. A horrible chill raked through her body and she felt like throwing up. She screamed and scrambled back, but it was too late. Something had grabbed her ankle and was pulling her down into the darkness under the bed. Marley was trapped, unable to move as the thing dragged her deeper into its lair. She could hear its breathing, rasping sound that made her skin crawl. The thing that held her ankle weighed Marley down, and she drifted down into another world. It was a dark and twisted place, a maze of shadowy corridors and dank, musty rooms. The thing released her ankles just as she landed on the dirty ground, tickling her toes again before it let her go. She could hear the creature's footsteps behind her, getting closer and closer. She tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. They seemed to have grown roots into the ground, and the skin of her toes crawled with the feeling of the cold tickling fingers. She was trapped, alone in the darkness with the thing that had dragged her down. Finally, she saw a glimmer of light up ahead. It was a door, just barely visible in the gloom. She slammed her eyes shut and willed her feet to move. When the sensation of tickling finally subsided, she was able to pick up her feet at long last. Marley ran towards the light, throwing herself through it just as the creature caught up to her. She slammed the door shut behind her, panting and gasping for breath. She caught a glimpse of the vile thing just before the door closed it out. A sinister creature, small and wiry, with spindly limbs and long fingers that ended in sharp, hooked claws. Its skin was a sickly shade of grey, stretched tight over its emaciated frame. Its eyes were large and black, and they seemed to glow with a malevolent light. The tickler had a mouth full of jagged teeth, and it grinned with twisted pleasure, once again reaching for her. But the door closed on it just in time, fading the awful world to black. And then, just like that, she was back in her own bedroom, safe in her own bed. She reality checked herself again, breathless as she tried to focus on her phone in a violently shaking hand. Correct time. Not blurry. This wasn't a dream. The fear never left Marley. She knew that the thing under the bed was still out there, waiting for its next victim. And she knew that it was only a matter of time before it came for her again. As the years went by, Marley heard more and more stories of people who had experienced similar things. There were reports from all over the world of children who had disappeared from their beds, taken by creatures that lurked in the shadows. There were tales of adults who had been dragged into other worlds, trapped in a nightmare realm that they could never escape from. And then there were those who simply disappeared, leaving no trace behind. They would go to bed one night, tucked in safe and sound. Then their bed would be empty in the morning, as though they had vanished into thin air. But Marley knew. She warned her friends and family, but they just laughed and shrugged it off as childish nonsense. Marley knew that these stories were more than just urban legends. She knew that there was something out there, something that was preying on those who let their guard down and allowed their feet to slip over the side of the bed. And so she issued a warning to anyone who would listen. She told them to be careful, to never let their guard down, to always keep their feet safely tucked under the covers, away from the darkness outside the bed. Because you never know what might be waiting for you, she said. You never know what horrors lurk in the shadows, just waiting for the chance to drag you down into their lair. And so, as you lie in your own bed tonight, remember Marley's warning. Remember that there is something out there, something that is always watching and waiting. And never, ever let your foot slip over the side of the bed. Because once it does, there may be no coming back.
In the darkness of the night, when the world is still and quiet, beware the bed where shadows hide, and something wicked lurks inside. It waits beneath the mattress springs, for children's toes to start to swing, and when they dangle down below, it strikes with fingers like a crow. Its touch is light, its laugh is shrill. It tickles toes with gleeful thrill. And when it's done with childish play, it drags its prey to hell to stay. So keep your feet tucked in tonight, and never let them out of sight. For if you do, you might just find that the tickler is not so kind.
It was the height of the Cold War, and tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States were at an all-time high. But while the two superpowers were locked in a struggle for global supremacy, there was another race happening in secret, a race to explore the depths of space. The Soviet Union had been the first to launch a satellite, the first to send a man into orbit, and now, they had done the unthinkable, they had landed a spacecraft on the moon. The world was in awe of the Soviet Union's accomplishments, but little did they know what horrors awaited them on the lunar surface. The mission had been shrouded in secrecy from the very beginning, with only a select few high-ranking officials knowing the true purpose of the mission. The Soviet Union had long been obsessed with the occult and the supernatural, and they believed that the moon was a source of untold power and mystery. They had poured vast resources into developing technology to explore the lunar surface, and their efforts had paid off. They had discovered something truly terrifying. The crew of the Soviet spacecraft had landed on the far side of the moon, in a region that had never been seen by human eyes. As they stepped out onto the lunar surface, they were greeted by a sight that chilled them to the bone. The landscape was dotted with strange, towering structures that seemed to defy the laws of physics. They were made of a material that the cosmonauts had never seen before, a twisted, black metal that pulsed with an otherworldly energy. The cosmonauts soon discovered that the structures were not abandoned. They were inhabited by a race of beings that defied description, beings that had long ago abandoned their physical bodies and had become beings of pure thought and energy. The cosmonauts tried to communicate with them, but the beings were hostile, and their thoughts were filled with madness and malice. As the cosmonauts explored the lunar landscape, they began to experience strange phenomena. Their instruments malfunctioned, their communications were jammed, and they were plagued by bizarre hallucinations. They soon realized that they were not alone on the moon. The beings had infiltrated their minds and were using them as pawns in a terrifying game. One by one, the cosmonauts began to succumb to the madness. They turned on each other, lashing out in fits of violent rage. They began to see things that weren't there, dark shapes moving in the shadows, voices whispering in their ears. And always, there was the presence of the beings, watching from the shadows, manipulating their thoughts and emotions. The final cosmonaut to succumb was Yuri, the mission commander. He had been the most stoic and level-headed of the crew, but even he could not withstand the onslaught of madness and terror. He began to see visions of a future where the beings had conquered Earth, a future where humanity had been enslaved by their dark power. And in that moment, he knew what he had to do. Yuri activated the self-destruct sequence on the spacecraft, knowing that it was the only way to prevent the beings from returning to Earth. As the countdown began, he could hear the laughter of the beings in his mind, mocking his feeble attempts to resist their power. But he refused to let them win. He closed his eyes, whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening, and waited for the end. The explosion was heard on Earth, and the world mourned the loss of the brave cosmonauts who had sacrificed their lives for the sake of humanity. But the truth of what happened on the moon remained a secret, buried under layers of Soviet bureaucracy and propaganda. The Soviet Union continued its dominance of the space race, sending more missions to the moon and even establishing a permanent base on its surface. But rumors began to circulate among the scientific community, rumors of strange occurrences on the lunar surface, of unexplained phenomena and mysterious disappearances. And as more countries began to explore space, they too began to encounter the strange beings that had haunted the Soviet cosmonauts. It soon became clear that the Soviet Union had stumbled upon something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The beings on the moon were not content to remain confined to their lunar prison. They were spreading, infecting the minds of those who dared to venture into the depths of space. And so, a new race began, a race to uncover the truth about the beings and to find a way to stop them before it was too late. But the beings were clever, and they remained one step ahead of their pursuers, always staying one step ahead in the shadows. And so, the horror on the moon continued, a silent menace that threatened to consume all who dared to venture into the darkness of space. The Soviet Union may have won the space race, but in doing so, they had unleashed a terror that would haunt humanity for generations to come. As the years passed, more and more nations sent missions to the moon, hoping to uncover the secrets of the beings that had haunted the Soviet cosmonauts. But each time they did, they found only more questions and more horrors. Scientists studying the lunar samples brought back by the missions found traces of the strange, alien material that the Soviet cosmonauts had encountered. The material seemed to have a consciousness of its own, and those who studied it soon found themselves consumed by an unexplainable dread. As the years turned into decades, the fear of the beings on the moon began to spread, becoming a pervasive and unsettling presence in the public consciousness. People whispered of strange occurrences in space, of ships disappearing without a trace, of cosmonauts returning to Earth forever changed. And still, the beings remained a mystery, their true nature and intentions unknown. Some speculated that they were ancient beings, older than the universe itself, while others suggested that they were the product of some unimaginable experiment gone wrong. But despite the fear and uncertainty that the beings on the moon had wrought, humanity continued to explore the cosmos, driven by an insatiable curiosity and the desire to understand the universe and our place within it. And so, the horror on the moon remained, a silent reminder of the dangers that lurked in the darkness of space. And while humanity may never truly understand the beings that had haunted the Soviet cosmonauts, they would continue to venture forth, driven by the hope that one day, they might unlock the secrets of the universe and find the answers to the mysteries that lay beyond our world.
Jasper Ludwig stumbled home around 3 a.m. As usual, he had to give the dented metal door to his apartment a hard shove with his shoulder to open it. It squealed loudly on its hinges and Mrs. Berkowski next door instantly beat on the wall to grouchily demand silence. Although, her TV was blaring through the paper-thin walls. Did that old hag ever sleep? Jasper stumbled walking in the door over a stack of old advertisers and his work boots, on the floor just inside the door. He was sticky with sweat and still felt the adrenaline coursing through his veins from his band's gig at the local dive bar. The Dirty Riffs had put on a show of all-right caliber, just like they did 3 nights a week. The last set had been a bit rough, since the rhythm guitarist drank too much and fell off the stage, but the crowd loved it. Jasper felt like he was on top of the world at that moment. That is until he saw him. A figure was standing in the middle of his living room, shrouded in darkness.
Who the heck are you?
Jasper demanded, his hand searching for something, anything, he could use as a weapon. The figure stepped forward into the light, and Jasper's jaw dropped. It was Jimi Hendrix. The legendary guitarist and singer, dead for over 50 years, was standing in his apartment. Jasper couldn't believe it. He had been a huge Hendrix fan for years, even modeling his guitar playing after him. This was a dream come true. The rocker stood dead center of Jasper's messy living room. He was slightly translucent and surrounded in a glimmering purple haze. He was not as tall as Jasper had always imagined, even though his feet hovered off the floor and he drifted in midair. On the wall behind Jimmy was a giant poster of Jimmy, and Jasper suddenly felt infinitely happy he'd chosen that particular decor. He was slightly embarrassed about the stink though. Could ghosts smell?
Groovy poster, my brother.
Jimmy said in a gravelly voice, gesturing over his shoulder toward Jasper's living room artwork. Jasper was beaming. It felt like he might actually have a heart attack. He was only 23, so he'd never felt like having a heart attack. But he was pretty sure it might happen right then. Oh well, then he could be a ghost with Jimi freaking Hendrix.
Bro, what are you doing here?
Jasper shouted. Mrs. Burkowski next door delivered 3 hard slams to the wall, but Jasper barely noticed. Before he even thought twice, he rushed forward to embrace the dead rock star. And he fell right through the specter. Jimi Hendrix burst into hysterical tears. Alarmed, Jasper cajoled the bedraggled ghost into the nearest seat, which was a tattered and rather disgusting armchair. An ashtray on the arm of the chair brushed off onto the floor when Jimmy whooshed down into the seat. It broke on the concrete floor and ashes spread everywhere, but Jasper barely noticed.
I'm sorry, man.
Jimmy blubbered.
I can't do hugs anymore and it kinda bums me out, you know?
The phantom wept bitterly and glowing snot spread across his face.
That's okay, buddy.
Jasper insisted.
My feelings have been so big since I died, my man.
Jimmy went on.
It's strange.
It didn't take long to get Jimmy calmed down and ready to chat. Luckily, Jasper didn't have to work his day job in the morning because it was Friday night. So, he could afford to stay up a little longer. Good thing, because Jimi Hendrix had a lot to say. He talked about how to haunt a music venue properly so that you could sort out the sound system. He told stories of how he and Elvis sometimes enjoyed haunting the same places and pranking living rockers. It turns out, he was even a conspiracy theorist who claimed the moon landing was fake, even though it had happened only months before Hendrix died. One thing he didn't ever explain was why he had turned up there in Jasper's dump of an apartment. The sun was beginning to come up and Jasper could hear birds twerping outside when his eyes drooped heavily and his head started nodding. He finally had to interrupt Jimmy in the middle of a story about having beers with Waylon Jennings.
Buddy, I'm so sorry, but I gotta crash out, I'm beat.
Jimmy laughed, a low rich chortle.
Right on, man, right on. I always forget you livers have to sleep. No problem. Go ahead and hit the sack. I'll make myself at home.
Jasper fell into his messy bed with barely enough energy left to pull his blanket over him. He was still shocked to be in the presence of such greatness. And apparently, he was going to stick around. How could he have gotten so lucky? 2 hours later, he didn't feel quite as lucky. He was sleeping like a baby and then, bam! Yanked from peaceful slumber by none other than Jimi Hendrix, who'd plugged in Jasper's guitar and began to shred the Star-Spangled Banner. Loudly. And of course, Mrs. Burkowski, not only violently beating on the wall but also screaming obscenities. Imagine telling Jimi Hendrix to pipe down. Who does that? Mrs. Burkowski was so incredibly embarrassing. Jasper found his legs and stumbled to the living room. He noted that Jimmy had apparently had some drinks as a brigade of empty bottles were scattered at his feet around the chair and a cigarette smoldered in the same ashtray he'd earlier spilled but had now refilled with fresh butts.
Jimmy! Jimmy! Jimmy!
Jasper said, motioning downward with his hands.
So sorry, buddy, but I gotta ask you to turn it off. My neighbor is a grump. Not to mention, I'm still pretty tired.
Jimmy laughed, scooped up 2 beers and clinked them together, offering himself a cheers.
Apologies, my brother. I forgot.
He stood up, carefully placing Jasper's guitar into the chair and coming to clap Jasper on the shoulder. Of course, his hand phased through Jasper and Jimmy burst into tears again. Jasper sighed, and spent the next half hour trying to console Jimmy while Mrs. Burkowski beat the wall. Weird how Jimmy couldn't touch people but he could play guitar and drink beer. Being a ghost seemed fairly cool to Jasper. Soon he was back in bed. But then soon after that, Jimmy was waking him up again. Hendrix wanted to ask Jasper if he and the other members of Dirty Riffs ever played pranks. Because he was really trying to think of something good to get that Justin Bieber kid with. Jasper was slightly less understanding about being awoken that time. As the days began to pass, Jasper realized that having a ghost in his apartment wasn't all it was cracked up to be. For one thing, Hendrix was messy. Like, even messier than Jasper, who was already pretty messy. Jimmy left cigarette butts and empty beer bottles everywhere, and his ghostly form seemed to attract dust and grime like a magnet. No wonder his purple glow was so hazy. Worse than that, though, Hendrix was needy. He constantly wanted Jasper's attention, and would follow him around the apartment, trying to engage him in conversation.
I remember when I wrote Purple Haze,
Hendrix said, wistfully.
Those were the days, man.
Jasper nodded politely, but he was starting to get annoyed. He had a day job to go to on some mornings, and he needed his sleep. But Hendrix seemed to have no concept of personal boundaries, and he kept talking and talking. To make matters worse, Hendrix was a crier. He would burst into tears at the slightest provocation, whether it was a sad song on the radio or a particularly poignant memory from his past. At one point, Jasper thought it'd be cool to strum a cover of one of Jimmy's songs. But, apparently his rendition wasn't up to snuff because Hendrix cried over it. Once Jasper accidentally kicked over one of Jimmy's beers, and that made him cry. Jimmy sobbed hysterically once because Jasper chose to watch Beverly Hills 90210, instead of old clips of Jimmy. One morning, Jimmy discovered a thinning patch in his epic fro, and of course, he dissolved into hysterics. Who knew ghosts were so dang emotional? Jasper tried to be patient, but eventually, he couldn't take it anymore. He confronted Hendrix one night, telling him that he needed to move on to the afterlife. Hendrix was devastated.
But I don't want to go, man.
He wailed.
This world is so much cooler than the afterlife. Can I just stay here with you?
Jasper sighed, feeling a twinge of sympathy for the ghost. After all, what kind of guitar player would really kick Jimmy freaking Hendrix out of their apartment? If the Dirty Riffs only knew. They'd probably kick him out of the band. But he knew he couldn't continue living like this. He needed his space, and he needed his sanity. Plus the stink of his apartment had exceeded even his tolerance levels.
I'll tell you what,
Jasper said, after a moment's thought.
I'll let you possess me for one night, and you can play a show. But after that you have to go into the light. Agreed?
Hendrix's face lit up with a ghostly smile.
Really?
He murmured, his eyes glimmering with tears. Jasper sighed.
Now Jimmy, no need to cry. It'll be all right.
Jimmy pursed his lips and nodded rapidly, but then he made the noise that had become familiar, the little whimper that started deep in his throat and then erupted into a full-blown wail of uncontrollable emotion. Jasper groaned and scrambled to comfort the dramatic haunt, but couldn't quiet him quickly enough to keep Mrs. Burkowski from losing her ever-loving mind. The night of the show arrived. Even though it was just another show at the old dive, Boozy Blues, with his familiar band mates of Dirty Riffs, it felt like he was taking the stage of Madison Square Garden. Jasper strode into the limelight with long lazy strides. He could feel Hendrix's presence inside him. The colorful lights came up and Jasper/Jimmy drove his fingers down across the strings, shredding the performance to life. Jimmy guided Jasper's fingers across the fretboard of his guitar. Energy sizzled amongst the members of the Dirty Riffs. Jasper's sudden burst of super talent inspired the band mates and they jammed like they'd never jammed before. The happy drunk patrons of Boozy Blues went absolutely wild, never having any idea that they were listening to Jimmy freaking Hendrix deliver his last performance before crossing over into the light. But then something strange started to happen. Jasper could feel Hendrix's personality taking over, and he knew that he was no longer in control. Hendrix was using his body to play his music, and he was doing it better than Jasper ever could. Jasper tried to fight back, but it was like he was trapped inside his own mind, watching as Hendrix performed to a cheering crowd. It was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. Finally, the show was over, and Hendrix released his grip on Jasper's body. Jasper stumbled off stage, feeling drained and disoriented. Also, his face was covered with tears, because Jimmy had of course been crying. However, the tears probably blended with the sweat, so maybe no one noticed. A sense of peace and closure settled over Jasper in the shadows backstage after the show. Jasper collapsed into a nearby chair, feeling the weight of the experience he just had. He was still processing what had happened and what it all meant. He had helped Hendrix move on to the afterlife. Somehow he knew it even though Jimmy didn't say goodbye. Suddenly, he felt a strange sensation, like a cool breeze blowing through the room. He looked up and saw that Hendrix's ghostly figure was starting to fade away.
Is it time?
Jasper asked, feeling a lump form in his throat. Hendrix smiled at him.
Yeah, man. It's time for me to go. Thanks for everything.
Jasper nodded, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. He had enjoyed having Hendrix around, but he knew that it was time for him to move on. As Hendrix's ghostly figure disappeared completely, Jasper was left alone in the room, feeling a strange sense of emptiness. He realized that he had gotten used to having the legendary guitarist around, and that he would miss him. But he also knew that he had learned a valuable lesson. He had come to understand that even the people we idolize are just people, with flaws and quirks and messy lives. And sometimes, we have to let them go. Jasper picked up his guitar and started to play, feeling a newfound sense of purpose and direction. He knew that he still had a long way to go, but he was ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. As he played, he felt a sense of peace settle over him, like he was tapping into something bigger than himself. He knew that Hendrix would always be with him, in some way, and that he had been lucky to have had the chance to meet him, even if it was in the form of a ghost. And so, Jasper continued to play, pouring his heart and soul into his music, knowing that he was honoring the legacy of one of the greatest musicians of all time. 6 months later, after another killer show with the dirty riffs, a man in a suit approached Jasper. The mysterious guy extracted a business card from inside his suit jacket and handed it to Jasper.
I'm Eric Masterson,
the man said in a somewhat annoying vocal fry.
Call me,
he added just before spinning on his heel and making his way back through the crowd of the dark and grimy bar. Jasper looked down at the card and saw that Eric Masterson was from Sony Music Entertainment. He almost peed his pants.
No way.
He whispered.
No. Way!
Jasper looked up toward the ceiling and whispered a quiet thanks to his legendary hero and friend, Jimi Hendrix. He was so happy, he almost felt like he might cry.